so I've been there for 12 years now. And a lot of my work over the last few years is with mainly with the public sector. So I do a lot of work with the Malaysian government, as well as with some of the financial institutions here in Malaysia. I know you mentioned that you'd like to hear more about BCG and myself, but I've actually prepared a presentation on a very different topic, which I thought would be interesting to share. And after this presentation, if you want to talk about BCG or if you want to talk about my experience, I'm happy to do that. But if you allow me, maybe I'll just take you through this presentation that I've put together. I thought that this would be interesting to share on this topic, on the story of actually Southeast Asia. And it's very topical in the sense that everyone right now is looking at the global economy, everyone is looking at what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the US, and all attention is on Asia. Where the growth is potentially going to come from Asia. It will never replace what Europe or US has been doing, but certainly a lot of spotlight is on Asia. But when people talk about Asia, they always talk about China or India, right? So what about Southeast Asia? So actually, we have, in the past decade, we have actually undergone some growth, and I would say a period of economic renaissance after the 97-98 crisis. It took us about a few years. Malaysia, I think after 5 years, we were back on track to where we were in terms of our growth pre-crisis. And a lot of this is happening quietly in the background, whereas the attention has always been on China and India. What we do every year is we issue this report, which we call the BCG Challenger Report. And what it is actually, it does a spotlight on companies in emerging markets. And so these are high growth, high potential companies who are, as the name suggests, challengers. So challengers that will take on the region or challengers that will take on global players. So we've been doing that since 2006. Last year, we decided to do a report just on Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian challenges. So in this report, we actually profile 50 companies. And this is a story that I just want to share, and I think it's a very interesting story to talk about. So before we go to the companies, maybe we just look at Southeast Asia first as a region, and just some economic data on Southeast Asia. So if Southeast Asia is actually a nation, or if it's a country, if you think about the ASEAN countries, if it's considered as one nation, it would be at par with the BRIC nations by any measure. So by any measure of the metrics that you want to look at it, it can actually be at par with China, India, Brazil, or Russia. So if you look at GDP, 3 trillion GDP, which is much bigger than Brazil, much bigger than Russia. In terms of growth, more than 7%. Again, much faster than Russia, much faster than Brazil, and creeping up on India. In terms of population size, 500 million in Southeast Asia. And in terms of involvement in world trade, it's about 7%, which is again much higher than Russia, Brazil, or India put together. So you can also argue that India or even China is a collection of many different countries. So if you want to think about it in that sense, you can think about Southeast Asia as well as a nation. And increasingly, the region is becoming a lot more integrated, especially with Singapore playing the role as a hub for logistics and financial services and so on. And I'm sure you've heard about the ASEAN Integration 2015 measures and so on. So, this will increasingly make Southeast Asia as an economic bloc a lot more important. So it's really something that, we should be proud and we should talk about. So what's actually driving our growth in Southeast Asia? A couple of things. One is the increasing middle class. So by 2015, we estimate that there will be 100 million more people in ASEAN entering the consumer class. So that's a huge number. You're talking about 24,000 households which will have a household income of above 5,000 USD. So that's above the threshold of low income. You're already moving into the middle income. And what this actually means is that consumer spending will go up. So 100 more million people with extra spend. And we estimate that there will be 12% growth in spending of this consumer class over the next few years. And they're going to spend on things like housing, healthcare, transportation, and so on and so forth. So this is one big driver of Southeast Asia's growth going forward. The second is we're very fortunate to be endowed with natural resources. And I think you all know this story very well. Malaysia, for example, we have a lot of natural resources that have actually contributed to our economic growth. So 87% of the world's palm oil, the demand of palm oil globally comes from this region, as 87%. 80% of rubber that's used globally also comes from this region, and 44% of natural gas that's supplied to ASEAN as a whole comes also from this region. So this is again another big driver of growth for Southeast Asia. What else? If we look at our labour pool in Southeast Asia, and what we've shown here, I don't know whether it's too small for you at the back, but essentially we have quite a competitive labour pool, and we see a lot of investors coming in to take advantage of this. So for example, I'm sure you all know of the call centers in the Philippines, for example. There are about 800 call centers, and revenues that they make from overseas alone is around $6 billion US. That's huge. A lot of multinationals are setting up their shared services in Malaysia. So you have large companies like Vale and Shell setting up shared services in Malaysia, so slightly higher skill, but then again also taking advantage of our labour pool. And also a lot of IT outsourcing is also increasingly happening in Vietnam. So that certainly gives us an advantage. Governments in Southeast Asia also taking a lot of measures, as I said, to try and integrate. One of the first things that was done, many years ago, was to talk about reducing the tariffs, the trade barriers, mainly around duty. And so there's increasing flow of goods, especially goods exports and imports within the ASEAN region. So certainly a growth story as well. And with all this behind us, all these drivers that's driving the growth of Southeast Asia, a lot of companies are actually becoming much more bolder. Banks have very strong balance sheet, corporates have also got strong balance sheet, even consumers have got strong balance sheet. So you start to see emerging companies who are emerging, or what we consider as emerging challenges. And so the story, this story is very important for us to note, and a story that we, at least at BCG here in Southeast Asia, that we also make sure that we communicate this story. Because if you go to places like Europe, so I was in Madrid last week, and that's where all the problems are happening, and things are so bleak. All that people talk about is Greece going to leave the EU, or is the Spanish banks going to be recapitalized? So it's a very sad story. Nobody talks about growth, but when we are here in Southeast Asia, the clients that we work with, they're all talking about double-digit growth. So a lot of my colleagues, in fact, from the more developed countries, are really interested to transfer out here into Asia, into Southeast Asia, where really a lot of the exciting things are happening. And so what we did was we said, okay, so who are these companies that are really going after the growth? So who are these challenges? And we went through a process of looking at 500 companies across ASEAN, and we narrowed it down to about 50 companies. And these companies are essentially companies with headquarters here in Southeast Asia, significant operations in Southeast Asia, highly profitable, growing, have got a very clear strategy for growth, and are going international, or have very clear plans to go international. And we came up with a list of 12 each in Malaysia and Indonesia, 11 each in Thailand and Singapore, and 2 each in Vietnam and Philippines. And a lot of these companies, unless you are in the industry, you would not know of these companies, or you would not have heard of these companies outside of this, outside of the industry. But we believe that in a few years, many of these companies will actually be regional, if not global players, and that you would know of them. Some names, I don't know if you're familiar, if I read the name in Thailand, Banpu or Indorama or Minor Group or Pruxa, I don't know how many of you are familiar with those names. Or even names of companies in Indonesia, Adaro Energy, Garuda, Jaro, maybe you're familiar with that, Indofood, Mayora, and so on. So these are actually very successful companies And like I said, beyond the industry, if you're not part of the industry, you would actually not know of these companies. And out of the 50, a majority of them are in consumer goods, in the food and beverage industry, and another 14 are really in the resources, which is actually placed to the strength of this region. And so why do we say these companies are challenges? The next slide. If we look at their growth, oh, by the way, these companies, their sales range from 500 million US to around 60 billion US, so fairly sizable. So if you look at their growth in their revenue, they're significantly higher than their global peers. So they're growing at about 18% per annum between 2001 to 2010. Their global peers, which are companies in the same industry but having headquarters globally and also operations globally, have only been growing at half that rate. And in terms of margins, their margins are at 15%, whereas their global peers are only at 13%. And so interestingly, if you were to put $100 in 2000 in a basket of these 50 companies, by 2010, that amount would already translate to $590 over a 10-year period. And if you compare that against some of the index, the emerging market index, or even the global peers, it's 1.5 times, twice more in terms of value that's created if you invest in a lot of these companies which we consider as Southeast Asia's challenges. So some of them have become leaders already. One of the criteria that we use is that these companies should not be a global leader for more than 5 years or more. So that's why you don't see Petronas, for example, on the list, because Petronas is already pretty much a global player, and they've been in that position for a while. But these are challengers who are, just either having a leadership role in the industry, a leadership position, and fairly new, less than 5 years. So Air Asia, okay, that's a name that everybody knows. And Air Asia is, majority of their revenues comes from overseas. They don't rely on domestic market anymore. And they are truly the #1 low-cost airline if you measure their, their cost per seat, available seat kilometer. It is really truly the lowest cost. Changi Airport, for example, in Singapore, has won multiple awards for being the best global airport. And then you have people like, Thai Union, world's #1 tuna can producer and exporter. I mean, how many of you have actually heard of Thai Union? Right, so you have? Oh, great, okay, good. So some of them are already, world leaders and global leaders. Indorama, which is another company that I'll talk about, they are #1 in their segment or in their category globally, and that's a Thai company. But one of the things that's actually driving their growth, a lot of them, they actually go through M&A, so mergers and acquisitions. They don't do it organically. So that's why you see the rapid growth. And the way they do acquisitions as well, they have a clear strategy, and I'll show you one company later, an example of what that company has done. So a lot of their growth comes from acquisitions, 9%, growth in terms of acquisitions over the last 10 years. Most of it cross-border, so it's not domestic acquisition, so they're going outside of their local markets in terms of acquisition. And out of this 50 companies, there are 14 of them that have completed more than 10 deals. That means more than 10 acquisitions in the last 5 years. And another 14 that have done between 5 to 10 deals in the last 5 years. And there's about 3 of them that have been doing recently deals that are worth more than $5 billion US. And this is MMC, which is a Malaysian company, is one of it, Wilmar, and Singapore's Capital Land. So this is one of the drivers of how they're growing very, very rapidly. And a lot of them share some common characteristics. They have a very clear business model, what they want to go after, how they organize themselves, and the strategy. It's very clear. They develop very specific capabilities. So some of them will have very strong capabilities in sourcing or supply chain management, and they use that to their advantage. A lot of these companies, actually not a lot, all of them, they are very ambitious companies. So like I said, they're coming from this region, a lot of them are looking at growth, double-digit growth. So they're very, very ambitious, and a lot of these companies are driven by leaders or CEOs who are also, going after very bold targets. And many of them also have, they don't carry the baggage of legacy assets. So they don't carry a lot of high-cost assets in low-growth markets. So they've actually managed to, well, for a start, they don't have it. Or if they do have some assets in these markets, they've managed to actually turn it around. So these are some capabilities that they have built to actually make sure that they succeed. And what we did was then to say, okay, so those are the things that are similar about these 50 companies. Is there some differentiation between these 50? And what we noticed was you can actually break them into 4 groups. You take those 50, you break them into 4 very distinct categories. All of them successful, all of them display similar characteristics, but there are some differences. So many of them, a large number of them, are actually in this segment that we call a segment that's monetizing the Southeast Asia's resources. So these are companies who are really taking advantage of Southeast Asia's natural resources. So companies like, Adaro that goes into coal or energy in Indonesia, or Sandabi, I think we all know, palm oil, right? So these are companies that are very much focused on natural resources and natural endowment. And one of the advantage that they have is around their supply chain capabilities. And what helps their growth is as trade and investment barriers come down, between governments and arrangements around trade barriers, trade defenses come down, it makes it a lot more attractive for them, and it makes their growth also a lot more faster. So many of the 50 are actually in this first category. Then there's a second group which we call building regional dominance. So these are companies who have built strength in their own local market, and then they use this position of strength to grow regionally. And a very good example is actually Malaysian companies, Axiata, CIMB, AirAsia. So these companies have very strong position in the local market, and this gives them an edge. And they're really very much focused on the ASEAN region, and really taking advantage of those the growing consumer class or the middle class that I was talking about. So these are companies that are going out to capture that opportunity. And then beyond this group, there's another smaller group, which we call growing with large RDEs, or these are really companies who are going after the much bigger emerging markets. So their ambitions are not just Southeast Asia, so they are looking at China, they are looking at India. So these are companies like Capital Land, Mayora, which I'll talk about shortly, which is an Indonesian company. And their success or their source of competitive advantage is they have a very good understanding of the consumer in emerging markets. So again, the middle class consumer, but not just limited to Southeast Asia, but the emerging 1 billion consumer that's coming up in India, in China. And they have essentially nailed it, in terms of coming up with the right business model to go after these consumers. And what gives them advantage as well, they're very flexible. So they're very flexible to adjust their business models depending on which market that they're going after, and depending on the consumer group that they're going after. And so these companies have been highly successful with this advantage. And finally, a very small number of the 50 are in what we call dominating global niche. So these companies, they are global companies, so they are Southeast Asian companies, headquarters in Southeast Asia, but they have global presence, and a large portion of their revenues also comes from markets globally. And they dominate in a very specific segment or a very niche market. So they don't try to do everything, but they're very specific, and at what they do it very well. So these are companies like Indorama, which I'll talk about shortly, YTL Group, and also Keppel. So this gives you a flavor that we are a region that has ambitions to grow, companies who are equally ambitious, and we have, like I said, companies with very strong balance sheet, banks to give them the support to actually grow. And so, yeah, sorry, I was saying a lot of the attention when people talk about Asia is very much focused on China and India. And to a certain extent, Southeast Asia has been very much under the radar screen. But if you think about the growth of Southeast Asia over the last 10 years, especially coming out of the 97, 98 crisis, we've actually bounced back quite strongly and fairly quickly. And as I was saying earlier, that Malaysia, for example, it took us just 5 years to get back to pre-crisis levels in terms of our economic growth. So I thought it was just appropriate for this evening to share this topic on Southeast Asia and the bold ambitions that many Southeast Asian companies are actually going after. And a lot of the clients that we work with here in this region, they're talking about double-digit growth, so no one is not talking about growth. Everybody wants to go regional, if not going global. But if you go to the other side of the world, you go to the developed markets like Europe, for example, the story is very different. It's very bleak and it's very sad. And as I was saying, a lot of our colleagues, BCG colleagues from Europe are also very attracted to come out to Asia, to Southeast Asia, spend a few years here and really be part of this exciting growth story. And so I was going into the 50 companies that BCG has profiled in our report, which we call the Challenger Report. And essentially the Challenger Report focuses on, or puts a spotlight on companies who are, as the name suggests, challengers. So companies who are going out there, taking on a lot of the existing incumbent regional and global players. So these are very fast-growing, highly profitable, successful Southeast Asian companies. And on this slide, what it actually shows is that of the 50 companies, how they can actually be segmented in terms of the sources of competitive advantage that each group has. So on the extreme left, where most of the 50 companies would fall in, are those companies who are really focused on monetizing or getting benefits from the natural resources that Southeast Asia has. The most extreme right are actually Southeast Asian companies, with HQ here in Southeast Asia, but they have gone global and they have had created a dominant position in a specific niche sector or a specific niche segment. So very strong at what they do, and they're doing it at a global basis. So that was where I was at the presentation. So what I want to do next is just share with you two of these companies and their stories, because they're very interesting stories. We have Malaysian companies, and I decided, I don't want to talk about Malaysian companies because I think we're all familiar with Malaysian companies. So I've selected a company from Thailand, one of the challengers, Indorama, and Mayora, which is an Indonesian company. So Indorama is one of those that's in the extreme right of the previous slide. So this is a company that has gone global and has dominated globally in its particular space. So what they focus on is on petrochemicals, and they do a lot of, they use these chemicals to produce fabrics and also plastic bottles. So that's Indorama, and Mayora is a consumer goods company focused on food and beverage. So if you look at this company, Indorama, what we have on this slide, if you look at the markets, in terms of their markets, 14% of their sales is in Thailand, but a large majority, the remainder, is actually comes from Europe and North America. And their sales have been growing, at incredible rates, 56% from 2006 to 2010. I mean, that's crazy if you think about the numbers. And in 2010, it's 3 billion. In 2011, it's forecasted to be, or estimated to be, at 6 billion. And so this company, Indorama, it has multiple manufacturing plants, and in 5 countries. There are only 4 plants in Thailand, and the rest are in US and Europe. And they have a mixed strategy of growing or developing the plants from greenfield. So those are the boxes in green. But a lot of the others are actually through acquisition. And they acquire high-cost players in developed markets. So in the US and in Europe, they go to these markets and they actually acquire some of these plants in this market. So, and you think, why would they do that, right? It's just counterintuitive. So this is some of the things that they have done, which actually sets them apart from the industry players, from what everyone else is doing. So they have decided to just do the opposite, and it's actually been very successful and it's paid off for them. So most companies or most players in this industry, they're looking at Asia. And like I said, Asia is where the growth is, so everyone is just looking at Asia. For this particular sector or for this particular industry, the growth is about 12%. And a lot of companies are investing into capturing growth in China. Whereas Indorama is just doing just the opposite. So everyone's coming into Asia. What they're doing is actually going into North America and going into Europe. So a market which is, in terms of volume, much larger than Asia, but very low growth at only 4%. So they make a conscious decision to go into a mature market, and that's a market that's highly contested for. And so, would they think of doing this, right? So a lot of these companies in Europe and in North America, where they have their plants, which have not been successful, which have not been profitable, so they are selling off a lot of their assets, right? So these assets, they have not managed to run a lot of these plants efficiently, so it's become quite high cost for them. So what Indorama has done, so they've gone to these markets and they've actually bought these assets at a cost which is much, much lower than the replacement cost. So they got it at a very good price, and they got the timing right. And so when everybody was exiting Europe, selling out in the US, they went in and they bought out. And that wasn't all that they did, right? What they also did, one of their strategies on that side, when we say commodity, so they've gone really back to basics, which is just focus on a very small line of products. So they don't try to do everything, they don't try to get good at everything. So everyone else is talking about value adding. I mean, again, this is very counterintuitive, right? So all other players are putting in a lot of investments into R&D to value add on the products, coming up with specialty products, coming up with multiple products in their portfolio. Indorama is just doing just the opposite. So they say, we want to just focus on a few products, but we do it right, we get it right, we gain scale, so it becomes high volume, and so it becomes a very successful venture for them. So they try to keep their cost structure very low, and they get very specialized at what they are doing. And so by doing that, by commoditizing, they've actually become quite successful. So they have reduced the complexity in their business. So they've reduced it. Whereas other companies are introducing more products, increasing the portfolio, it gets more complex, and when things get more complex, it gets more complicated. And these guys, they're just doing the opposite, keep things simple. And so by doing this, this is one of it's actually a key driver for them being successful. And what this slide actually shows is the cyclicality in this business that they're in, this petrochemical business, and at each down point is when they actually go out to acquire. And they focus on very large plants that they can get scale, and they run it very efficiently so they keep their costs very low. And that has been their success story. So it's a very, very interesting story, and you wouldn't think that a Thai company could actually go out there and dominate in this particular, in a specific sector, but that's exactly what they have done, and that's where you've seen the huge growth figure of 56% is almost unheard of. This is another company. This is an Indonesian company, Mayora, one of the 50 challenges as well. Again, another interesting story. So they are focused in the consumer goods industry. So they focus on food and so it's mainly food and beverage products. You may know some of the brands like Kopiko. We have it here in Malaysia. And so they also have a very interesting strategy. So they go internationally, so they don't just rely on their Indonesian market, and about 30% of their revenues comes from international sales. And again, if you look at their growth numbers, also is phenomenal, 38% growth. Again, not something that you typically see. And a lot of this growth actually comes from this region. So they do have presence in India and in China, but this only makes up about 5% of their sales today, but potentially it could increase much faster. So they have their presence in 6 countries outside of their home market in Indonesia. So their biggest market next to Indonesia is actually the Philippines, and like I said, about 5% in China and India, but they expect to actually grow this much faster. And this company is actually run by, so before I go into what is their secret of success, this company is actually run, it's family-owned business. So the father is the CEO, and so he runs essentially the operations. And what's interesting is that a lot of consumer goods company, one of the key criteria of being successful is to be very good at consumer, understanding the consumer or having insights to the consumer. So what he relies on is a lot of his instincts in terms of what the consumer is looking for, and using that to actually guide the R&D in the products that they come up with. And then each of his sons, so he's got 3 sons, each of them has a functional role in the business. So son number 1 is in marketing, potential CEO. Son number 2 manages supply chain. Son number 3 manages all the support functions. So very much family owned, although now they are beginning to think about professionalizing the organization. So what is their secret of that 38% growth that you saw? So there's a couple of 3 things that they do very well. So one is they're very much focused on the consumer, on the customer. And what I showed just now, a lot of it is also the instinct, right, of the CEO. And he uses that to drive a lot of the innovation in terms of coming up with new products and R&D. So this is slightly different from the Indorama story, which was single product line, but that's a very capital intensive business. Whereas in the consumer business, you need to always be meeting or being ahead of your consumers and what they're looking for. So they're very much investing in R&D. And what actually gives them a big difference is their execution or time to market, time to get the product to market. So most multinationals would take a year, 2 years, from a point of, okay, we decide to enter a market to actually entering that market. Whereas these guys can do it in less than a year. And so that gives them that flexibility, actually gives them a lot of advantage. And in terms of their manufacturing, so they're very efficient. They own all of their plants, so in that sense they can maintain the efficiency as well as the quality of the product. So these are 3 things which they do very well, and they leverage on this strength to actually grow their business and target all the markets internationally. So just to give you an example, right, in terms of their speed to market, or how they're able to do this very quickly. So they have a target market in mind, so 2 of the 3 sons will go and visit the market, meet the distributors, go and have a feel of what the customer is looking for, get some of the products that's in the market, and then come back to Indonesia, bring the products home, discuss it within the family group, do a bit more market research to understand the opportunity in that segment, and then do some very quick analysis in terms of forecasting how much do we need to invest in this and what's the potential growth. So not getting bogged down by a lot of the red tape or the bureaucracy that you would find in large multinationals. And very quickly, very swiftly, the family can make a decision, whether it's a go, no go, and then select the product portfolio that they want to go to the market to, and just start exporting. So this flexibility and the ability to make decisions very quickly really gives them an advantage. Plus as I said, the manufacturing capabilities is very strong. So this has made the company Mayora very successful. Going forward, however, they do recognize that as they grow much bigger, you can't run a large organization like the way you would run a family business. So they have strategies in place with a clear vision, where they want to get to by 2015, and some very core initiatives or ideas that they want to put in place. So they are trying to professionalize the organization, but still maintaining the spirit of what makes Mayora different. So it's really a very interesting company. So a lot of the other challenges that we actually capture, they all have very interesting stories, and they all display very distinct characteristics that really sets them apart. someone was asking me during the break just now whether we can get a copy of this report. It's actually available on BCG Perspectives. It is online website, so if you go on there, you would find the full report there. There's a lot more interesting stories in there. So that's on the companies. So, you know, to ensure that Southeast Asia continues to grow, we do build more challenges. What are the implications, at least from the policy side, so on the side of the government or the public sector? So what are some of the challenges that these companies still face, and many more that, you know, may come after them will face? Talent shortage will continue, or it is still an issue in Southeast Asia, and will, you know, except for Singapore, will likely still be an issue for a while. Different countries are taking different measures. You know, in Malaysia we have our own set of measures, but that would certainly be one big barrier that companies would need to overcome. And in fact, a lot of these challenges that we talk to as well, that is their #1 issue for their CEOs, always the talent issue. Second is around infrastructure. So Southeast Asia actually requires significant investment still to develop the infrastructure and to make the markets actually a lot more viable. So there's a lot that the government, on the side of the government, that they can do with the private sector to actually boost in terms of infrastructure. Innovation. So some of the companies that I shared with you, at least those two companies, they are creative in the way that they do things, but a lot of companies still, in terms of innovation, there's still, you know, a lot to be desired. So that's another area that, at least for Southeast Asian companies, you know, when they think about going forward, investing more in innovation and being, you know, taking more risk and being more creative is something that we can certainly do a lot more of. Trade barriers. I talked about earlier how some of the trade barriers are slowly being removed. You know, tariffs are going down, but nevertheless, it's still a lot of, you know, the ease of doing business in a lot of Southeast Asian markets. You know, it's not easy. So it's still high barriers. Still a lot of bureaucracy, still a lot of regulation, you know, getting licenses to set up a business. So this is something really on the part of the government that they can do. And again, in Malaysia's example, there's efforts that have been put in place to try and remove some of these barriers. And of course, political instability, not in all ASEAN countries, but in some of these countries, this could actually be also a threat to further growth. And so, just to close off, I think the main takeaways from this presentation is, you know, for these challenges, really for them, they have already reached a certain level now where it's very easy for them to go regional and have regional dominance. And so for those who are not in that global space yet, they should, you know, we believe, go after, be a lot more bolder, and have ambition to go beyond the region. Other Southeast Asia companies should learn, or, you know, get some good learnings from these challenges. For the multinationals that are looking into this region, potentially think about partnering with the Southeast Asia challenges. And for the governments, as I mentioned earlier, there are still a lot of barriers that's in place that could impede the growth of more companies going forward. So that's my presentation, and, you know, I hope it gives you a flavor of the potential that's in Southeast Asia, and with some real examples of real companies who've actually done it and made a difference. So we are, you know, at BCG, we're very bullish about Southeast Asia, you know, despite the problems in the rest of the world. And it's a story that, as I said, you know, we continue to tell, and by sharing it here as well, I mean, I hope that you also have the sense of the potential in this region and the level of ambitions that we can actually go after. So thank you.
Hi there, my name is Yao Hui Min. So I actually just sat for my SPM last year, and currently I'm on my study break, so I don't belong to any institution whatsoever. But I'd like to ask a question in relation to the growth of ASEAN. Now, we all know when we are talking about ASEAN growth, you have to look from three big aspects: economic, political, and social. And today you've spoken much about the economic growth. So I'm concerned about more of the slight more social and political side. Now, speak in representation of the youth. I'd like to ask, 10 years from now, will there be traction in terms of all this economic growth? Will there be investment in youth development? Will there be an ASEAN Youth Council? And I'm just curious, is there currently an ASEAN Youth Council in the works in tangent with, for example, the ASEAN Economic Community?
I mean, interestingly, I get a lot of this question from youth like yourself around, the growth in any economy, and what does that mean to the younger generation, and it's something that whether you can relate to. So there's a couple of ways that I can think of just responding to your question. I mean, firstly, economic growth is very important in the sense that if you're thinking about the well-being of society and the well-being of the youth, so if there's no economic growth, then they'll create a lot of tensions, then there will be unemployment and so on that you see in a lot of other countries where growth is not present. So that, the uprisings and dissatisfactions that we see in the Middle East. So thankfully, or at least in Malaysia, we don't have that issue, and growth is there, and there are jobs and there are opportunities for everyone. And so I think where I'm going at is that for governments to think about economic growth, and that although it may not be expressly articulated, the implications or the benefits for the next generation, but implicitly, when you're going after growth, when you're trying to create more wealth, it's essentially really for the next generation. And a lot of governments, at least in ASEAN, are also thinking about investing in, well, education obviously is the most important one, investing in education as a priority for youth. To your question specifically, whether there is an ASEAN youth movement or organization, I'm not sure. I'm not, don't know specifically whether there is. But what I do know is that, just to give you an example, a lot of youth are getting involved in a lot of these discussions around economic development and economic growth. So the World Economic Forum, for example, they have regular dialogue sessions within the private sector and the public sector, and they do have a small group which they call the Global Shapers, the World Economic Forum Global Shapers, which are actually youth, and we do have actually some of our consultants actually being part of that. So they do get to sit on the high table with some of the top private sector players as well as the top leaders in government, and so they do get that opportunity to exchange and share views. So at least ASEAN, I'm not sure, but for the World Economic Forum, I know that there is that platform.
Hi, my name is Shen. So, listening to what you said just now was very interesting. What I was hoping you could answer was perhaps I'm really curious, one or two pivotal experiences you've had with one of these companies, perhaps, that shaped your career, maybe changed it in a way that was special and unique. Thanks.
Unfortunately, maybe fortunately, I do a lot of my work with the public sector. So a lot of my consulting work over the last several years have actually been working with the government, and mainly with the Prime Minister's Office and the Prime Minister's Department. My colleagues actually work with a lot of these companies. And so before I speak about my experience, just from the experience of my colleagues, some of the companies that they work with, we have very long-term relationships with. So we actually go from this point of helping them develop the strategy and actually quickly start implementing it and start to realize value from the strategy. So it actually makes a lot of difference when you go in and you not only give advice or not only give a report, but actually work hand in hand with the company and the organization to create value. So whether that has been an opportunity and created impact on my colleagues, yeah, for sure. So for me personally, like I said, I do a lot of my work on the other side with the public sector. And has it made a difference or made impact? For sure it has. Because some of the questions that we have to, that we are asked to help advise on some of the issues actually impact the private sector a lot. So whatever we advise or whatever we say will have implications. So we do a lot of policy type work, industry policy type work. So whatever policies that we come up with, and if the government does implement, it will have significant implications on industry players. So in that sense, you know, do I find the work, you know, does it impact on me? I mean, do I find the work interesting? Yes, for sure.
Hi, good evening. My name is Yahya. I'm from UCF Malaya. First, actually, I'm quite aspired to become a consultant after learning about BCG metrics. Yeah, actually. But then because you see that quite interested in for this is you see that ASEAN is Malaysia. So I'm asking, what is your opinion about Malaysia? Which part of BCG is it now? Is it in Jeshkau, Star, Kishima, or Dots? That is my first question. The previous question, you were saying that Malaysia is at the low bottleneck. So how do you define this? How do you ensure that Malaysia is at the low bottleneck?
I'll start from backwards. So low bottleneck is all very relative to the other countries. So in terms of, you know, trade barriers, for example, we are putting in efforts in place to try and remove some of the you know, stickiness of getting business put in place compared to, for example, trying to do business in Indonesia or in Thailand or in Vietnam. Right, to a certain extent, it's relatively easier in Malaysia, and the government is a lot supportive. I mean, sure, it's not straightforward, there are still issues, but relative to the other ASEAN countries, the bottleneck is less. So that's where Malaysia is, that's why it's at that green, light green color, and Singapore is the bright green. Your other question was, where is BCG Malaysia in the matrix?
Malaysia is no.
Malaysia?
Yeah.
Okay, it's an interesting question.
As one of the challenges.
Yeah. Well, I would say, you know, Malaysia is still in that star, you know, high growth potential. I mean, it's just a question of whether we can get our act together and get to do the right things, and which is kind of related to the other question around, you know, elections and so on. I mean, yeah, I think everybody feels that things are not moving and decisions are not being made until then.
Hi, my name is Henry. I'm just wondering, you talk about Southeast Asia growth. How about like China's PMI is dropping? Last month report, China's PMI is dropping. How China relationship between Southeast Asia and China? Are we too dependent on China, especially Malaysia? If China's economy not doing well in the next, maybe this year or next coming years, will us get affected? Thank you.
I'm not an economist and I won't make predictions, but my personal view is, yes, China's economy will slow down, but I don't think China will, you know, go to a stage of really low growth. So it's maybe not in the double digits in the past, but there's still a lot of growth happening in China, and the government is very well aware of that, and they're doing already putting in place certain measures. And to a certain extent, they're already stepping up when you see growth slowing down in Europe. You know, like I said, you know, consumers in China could never replace what the consumers in the US or Europe have been actually consuming. But I think China is already stepping up and, you know, putting in place measures to ensure that they do try to fill part of the gap that's been left by regions like Europe. So I think it's, yes, slowing, but it would never be to a low growth level. And, you know, I just want to share an interesting story about China. I was in China 3 weeks ago, so I could see the vast difference. So last week was in Europe, 3 weeks ago in China, and I visited Peking University, which is the Harvard of China, and had conversations with the students and the professors. And what actually, you know, blows you away is the aggressiveness of the youth there and the students there. So these people are highly competitive. I mean, competitive to maybe to the point that, you know, I personally think is unhealthy. But, you know, I mean, they are really driven, and all they know, like everyone that I talk to, everyone is competitive, everyone wants to be the best. And being in Peking University, that's the best of the best. And when I spoke to one of the professors, he used to teach at a few of the Ivy Leagues in the US, and he says, you know, the intellectual abilities of the Chinese students that he's teaching in Peking University is as good or maybe even better than the students that he used to teach at the Ivy Leagues in the US. The only difference is they don't have the benefit of huge, you know, funds and, you know, to go into research and so on that a lot of these universities in the US have. And another example, I don't know whether you're familiar with the PISA test, which is the test on science and English that schools take. So Shanghai took the test for the first time last year and they came out right on top of the list, #1 on the list. So these things are happening in China, which is quite scary. And if they also have their own issues, but they're still quite a significant force, and we should also be aware of what China is capable of.
Hi, I'm Hui Wen. I'm really willing to learn from you. Yeah, as a consultant, right, you are put in a very different business environment, and you are expected to come up with a business solution in a very short period of time. So there are two aspects. The first one, is there any strategy that you must go through, or any action plan that you must go through 1, 2, 3, 4, like to do a very quick business analysis and to identify the business gap? So identify the gap. And the second one, how do you make sure your action plan will be executed perfectly? It's not just some planning, it can be executed.
Yeah, so we do work in very short timelines, and at least our way of doing this, we never go in with a preset idea or preset recommendation, but what we do is we go in with what we call a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a view of what the issues are and what the solutions could be. And that hypothesis, it comes from a range of sources. It's if you've been doing consulting for a while, you have experience, you know the industry well, you do already go in with a set of hypotheses. And what we do in the project when we work with the clients is really focus on testing the hypothesis. So we don't go in and try and do every analysis that can be done. We're very specific and we're quite targeted at what we do. So that's how we actually we're actually able to get to a lot of the solutions very quickly. And to your second point, that's actually more difficult, because I find that coming up with ideas and solutions and doing analysis, that's actually the easy part. The really difficult part is how do you then make sure your clients actually execute on those, because the last thing you want, and it happens to all of us consultants, is that you just end up with a report, right? So that's what we consistently focus on, and when we work with our teams as well, that's what we say. Just make sure that it does get implemented, and there are different ways and different mechanisms of doing that. It's doing more than just the strategy, staying on with the client, showing very quick results, demonstrating, coaching the client team to do it. So at least BCG, where we're moving towards right now, is focusing more on staying longer with the client and ensuring that they are enabled to actually deliver on our work, rather than going, do a report and leave, because that's really no value for anyone.
Hi, good evening. My name is Yawen, and my question is more related to ASEAN. So I just recently came back from Thailand and Laos, and what struck me about ASEAN as a regional bloc and as an economic bloc in comparison with other blocs like Latin America and Europe is how diverse we are. It cuts through languages and religions. So I was just wondering, what are some ways we can do to actually foster a closer, more tight-knit ASEAN? Can you share your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Yeah, it is a diverse region, and so on the one hand, governments are trying to do things like trade agreements to reduce, trade barriers and trade defenses, and I think that helps. The whole idea of ASEAN integration, if it does happen, that would help, the free flow of goods and people and so on. I think language, differences in language and differences in culture, it comes down sometimes to the company-specific level and how you would actually deal with this. And companies that actually do well would be those that can adapt to the different markets that they're in, and make sure that they have the talent to actually understand and respond to what the market is looking for. So I know my answer is very broad, but just looking at the Mayora example, where they go to different markets and they're very successful in selling in these markets, is because they have a good understanding or a very good sense of what the consumers in that market want, and then you adapt to that market, right? So you don't have to be homogeneous and to look for a homogeneous market for your business to be successful. But what you need to be is how to be adaptive and to respond to the differences in the market. So in that sense, the private sector and even at the company level would have to take their own measures to make sure that they get the benefits of operating in multiple geographies and multiple locations. I mean, BCG, like I said, we also in Southeast Asia, we have operations in 4 different markets. We also do a lot of work in Vietnam. I mean, it's very diverse for a company. And what we do is we have a good mix of the talents that work with us, local as well as foreign talents, and so it brings a good balance. Some with technical expertise and some with the local knowledge and the understanding of the local requirements. So it's this sort of ability to be flexible and adapt is actually quite critical.
I just back from Australia, and in Australia there's a lot of venture opportunities for social enterprise. Yeah. My question is, because I believe that in order to, all our daily life is governed by the economics, and in order to increase the state of the society, social enterprise is one of the key solutions towards it. So my questions would be, what's the market like? Is there any opportunities in Malaysia for social enterprise? And how is the market value for social enterprise or social entrepreneurs in Malaysia? If there's opportunities, where and how we can seek the opportunities? And last but not least, how is the Malaysian company's perspective in social entrepreneurs? Yeah, that's all. Thanks.
The short answer is that there's not a lot in that space happening in Malaysia. And I think you would know also there's only a handful of social entrepreneurs or social enterprises out there. So it's very, very early stages for Malaysia. And in fact, when you think about even the large companies, and so their whole idea of doing social entrepreneurship or what, in BCG we also have what we call social impact. So this type of activities are really very transactional as well. So I think just in short to answer your question is that it's still very nascent and there's not a lot happening in that space yet. I know of a few people that I've spoken to are very interested and trying to build a presence in this space. So again, it's very much up to the individual and especially people in the younger age group. If you want to pursue that, I mean that's something you should actually if that's where your passion is, it's something you should go after.
Hi, my name is Adam. I'm from the Securities Commission. I want to ask a question about Malaysian PLCs. So in your opinion, in the course of your work, what are the sort of hurdles that BCG KL runs into in consulting for Malaysian PLCs? And also I wanted to see what your thoughts of the attractiveness of our PLCs. How does it compare to local players? And yeah, just basically the question along those lines, the perception basically.
So just understand, when you say PLCs, you mean the
public listed
companies?
Yeah, we're talking about the idea of Malaysian companies becoming regional players. So I wanted to see, coming from your point of view, in consulting for Malaysian companies, what are the hurdles that we face? Or it might be corporate governance or something like that. What's the perception amongst investors when they invest in the Malaysian companies?
Yeah. So there's quite a wide range, right, of companies and how they actually operate. And so the example that we picked, I mean, these are companies who are ambitious, bold, and have clear strategies. So they're clearly a segment that is this way. There's also, unfortunately, still a large number of companies who are just perhaps riding the wave of, for example, having access to advantage access to licenses or to natural resources or natural endowments, and being very complacent and not wanting to make a difference. I mean, there are those type of companies, and we have seen and we've worked with those companies as well. So I think to answer your question is quite a broad range, and really what this example of this exercise that we did was really to try and spotlight those companies who are actually making a difference and are actually being successful. And those who are not, it's just a combination of the mindset, it's a combination of the willingness to change, having the ambition to want to go after more. Talent is always an issue, and and not putting enough emphasis on having the right talent. So it's a range of companies and issues that we have seen in our group. It's very hard to just try and box it and say these are the reasons.
Good evening. My name is Shan Said. I just moved from Chicago to KL 5 months back. Your presentation is very general. I heard this presentation 5 years back when I was in Dubai. I think the biggest risk, if you follow Economist magazine, they had this conference in New York last July. Risk to the emerging market right now, the biggest is the political risk. And if you have been following Wall Street Journal, they have started talking about protectionism. And if you read the book, The End of Cheap China by my friend Sean Ryan, in China, people are concerned about the price inflation. So I think the biggest risk in the emerging economies is the political risk and the protectionism that is coming, and that is coming very strongly. Talent shortage, I was in Singapore, is there. I mean, infrastructure bottleneck, I mean, it's there. Go to Vietnam, go to Laos, go to Myanmar, go to India. I mean, Indian economy is slowing down, even Chinese economy is slowing down. Regarding China, you made a very interesting comment and you said Chinese economy will slow down. I think Chinese economy in the next 2 years, they will remove the capital controls, but they will have a very, very strong challenge, especially from the emerging economies, and I'm bullish on Malaysia. But if I were to compare Malaysia with Singapore, it's just like apples and oranges, because the productivity factor. I want you to speak, what do you think of protectionism and political risk? Thanks.
The political risk is there, like you can see in a lot of or some, not a lot, but some of the ASEAN countries. So, the example of what we have also noted even in this region, in places like Thailand and so on, that there is that element of political risk. And, protectionism for specific industries, when we deal with players, we do see countries having, despite lowering of duties and tariffs and so on, there's still the element of putting up certain trade barriers to inhibit imports coming in and so on and so forth. So those elements are still there, but my and also the view at BCG is that despite all of these barriers that are in place, the opportunity is still there, and we believe the opportunity is quite significant to go after. So there will always be issues. But it's a question of going around and getting your way around it and figuring out, at least at the company level, how you can actually create value for yourself and look for opportunities despite a lot of these barriers. And some of the companies that we have featured here, they've actually been very successful by actually doing that. And it's a range of strategies or mechanisms that they have put in place to actually achieve that. So yes, I agree with you. It's not straightforward. There are risks, there are barriers, and again, coming back to the Malaysia story, which I said earlier, that compared to all the ASEAN countries, actually we have a lot of potential, and we may not have a big population, we may not have a big size of our consumer, but a lot of our institutions are quite strong, and if we get that right, and we do have relatively a stable political environment, there's huge potential for us, but we need to make sure that certain things we do get it right.
Hi, I'm Farah Hana from Deloitte Consulting Malaysia. I was just wondering, how do you juggle your personal life amidst your demanding tight schedule? Like, you have time for family, for your friends.
That's a good question.
Yeah, well, no time for friends for sure. So, no, unfortunately, yeah, that's quite true. Yeah, it's not easy, and obviously, I just wish I had more hours in the day and more energy. So a lot of in terms of my priority is my family. So I've got 5 children. So they take up a lot of my time and energy. And so apart from the family, then it's the work. But what actually, it's not so much the juggling, it's whether you feel passionate and you enjoy what you do. And so, because I enjoy obviously my family and enjoy the work, it doesn't feel that it's so much of a challenge of trying to juggle. And then, like I said, the question of friends, it's really not much time for friends, unfortunately.
Hi, evening. My name is James Ho from Investment. My question is mainly about the relationship of leverage and growth. So basically, you say BCG is quite bullish about ASEAN, right? But there's been a lot of reports that say that private sector leveraging and consumer credit is at all-time high in Asian countries. And this is driving consumption. And there's been a report by the Bank of International Settlements saying that a lot of these Asian banks get their credit lines from EU banks. So looking at the issue in the EU banks currently, right, as they start to shore up their capital to meet Basel requirements, my question here is, when the leverage stops, will the growth also stop?
Yeah, I don't think that we are in a state where we were, say, during the 97 and 98 crisis, where the banks were very weak and there was over leverage and there was huge exposure to foreign borrowing and so on. So at this stage, I mean, even if you look at the Malaysian banks, we have they have pretty strong balance sheet, and our financial system is actually quite strong. So it's all really relative if you think about, you want to look at Malaysia compared, ASEAN compared to the other countries. So my view is, it's, I don't think that again, I'm not an economist, I'm not going to predict, but just my personal view is I don't think that there's such a huge risk, or that you would need to be thinking that growth might slow down. So I think growth will still come, and growth will still be there.